In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse, Chapter 6, Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. Jimmy and his grandfather crossed into their third state in 4 days, first Nebraska, then Wyoming. Now Jimmy watched as they drove by the Welcome to Montana sign on Interstate 90 going north. Less than an hour later, they turned right at an exit to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, past a convenience store on the left, and then a log trading post and a restaurant further up the hill. They turned right again. A 2-lane road led up to a tiny stone building just in the front of the entrance and gates. Grandpa Niles paid the fee and took a brochure from the young park ranger. Jimmy looked around at a hilly landscape. He had the same strange feeling he had had at the 100-in-the-hands battlefield. He felt like he should be quiet or talk only in a whisper. There was one thing he could not figure out. The whites had lost this battle, and yet they wanted to remember it. Past the gate, they followed the road towards the parking lot. Off to the right were houses. At the western edge of the parking lot was a 2-story stone building. The parking area went farther to the south, bending slightly to the east. South of the stone building was a cemetery with rows and rows of white headstones. At the southern end of the parking lot were 2 more buildings. First housed bathrooms, and the other, larger building was a visitor center. Grandpa Niles drove slowly through the parking lot, a slight frown on his face. "Tell you what," he said, "let's do the battlefield first, then finish with the visitor center." Jimmy nodded. The parking lot was nearly full of sedans, SUVs, pickup trucks, and even a few motorcycles. Along the side of the road was a large motorhome and some cars in tow. Making a slight turn right, they drove up the hill. They got out of the truck and walked to the monuments. On the left was a new one dedicated to Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. It was a wide circular pit with 2 openings, one on the east and one other on the west. On the hilltop to the right was an older monument. It was a large, 4-sided, and it sat atop a mass grave. In the grave were the white soldiers who had died 138 years before. Below the monument were white headstones inside a black iron fence. There were no graves, only markers, each indicating where a soldier had fallen. One of them bore the name of George A. Custer, a commanding officer of the U.S. 7th Cavalry. The seventh was a regiment defeated by the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho on June 25, 1876. The hill that the monument was on was known as Last Stand Hill. Grandpa Niles cleared his throat. Many still believe that Custer and his soldiers fought to the last man until all of them were killed. It's true, all were killed, but there was no last stand. There wasn't? Jimmy asked. What happened? Less than 30 soldiers reached this far. One of them was Captain Tom Custer. He was the younger brother of George Custer. The other 200 had fallen along the way. They were down along a mile-long ridge. You'll see the markers when we go that way. The paved road passed between the monuments and turned south. Grandpa Niles decided that they would drive to the far end of the battle site. It was a place called Reno Benteen Hill, 4 miles from the Last Stand Hill. The way it was, June 25th and 26th, 1876. The encampment filled the river bottom for 2 miles along the meandering river. To the Lakota, the stream was greasy grass. It wound north to south and had many bends. The encampment was on the west side, among some very large and tall cottonwood trees. This enormous village, one of the thousands of lodges, had moved to the greasy grass river only 2 days before, but the people had been together for 2 months by then. First gathering was far to the east and smaller. At first there was only a few hundred people, but, as the days went by, more and more people came. The village slowly grew to a few thousand. They were responding to Sitting Bull's message to gather and talk about the encroachment of the white people. A month ago, Sitting Bull had conducted a sun dance in the most holy and powerful of the Lakota ceremonies. People from all 7 Lakota bands were there. So was a small group of Nakota. The Cheyenne numbered several hundred. The Arapaho were fewer than that. Some people even slipped away from the reservations to join the gathering. By the time they moved to the greasy grass, there were nearly 10,000. Almost 1,200 of them were warriors. Never before had there been so many horses in one place. Large grassy flats west of the village were filled with 15,000 horses. Such a herd was very colorful on the green prairie. Most of the horses were bays, brown, or blacks, but there were buckskins, tan, and sorrels, reddish as well. Only a very few were white or gray. A herd that size could eat all the grass on the large prairie very quickly. That was one reason the encampment moved several times. The people moved to new areas where there were grass for their horses to eat. The horses were very important. Every Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho family had several. Horses for riding carried people. Other horses hauled lodge poles and folded lodges when people moved from one place to another. Still others were used as war horses, meaning they carried warriors into battle. The fastest runners were trained to chase buffalo. Horses were one reason the Lakota became a strong nation and controlled a large territory. 8 days after the battle where the girl saved her brother, people were still talking about it. The battle had occurred a long day's ride to the south along Rosebud Creek. Crazy Horse and 500 warriors had fought 1,000 long knives. With the long knives, there were 300 Shoshone and Crow warriors. After that, the Long Knives turned back south. The moon of ripening berries, or June, was a hot month. This day was already hot at noon when Crazy Horse walked north through the encampment. People were busy visiting, cooking, hauling water, and taking horses to the river to drink. Children ran and played. Young men and older boys were posted around large horse herd to keep watch. All in all, it was a very ordinary day. The sun was in the middle of the sky when a Lakota man appeared on the hill across the river. He was shouting. "Long Knives!" he yelled, as loud as he could. "Long Knives are coming!" Only a few people in the south end of the encampment heard him. Some, though they could hear him shouting, could not hear his words clearly. Gunshots suddenly boomed from the south, many gunshots. The first warriors who heard reacted immediately. Running to their lodges, they grabbed weapons, guns and bows and arrows, war clubs and lances, and ran towards the sounds of the guns. Some got on horses and rode. Everyone at the south end of the village could hear the guns now. So much gunfire was not good and usually meant danger. So much gunfire usually meant enemies. It was better to think that and do something than to wonder and be confused. Enemies attacking were nothing new to the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people. Mothers and grandmothers gathered up children to take them to safety. Old men helped them or instructed the young men to grab weapons and meet the enemy. People shouted warnings. "Long Knives are coming! Long Knives are coming!" The frightening news swept through the camp, and moving up like a sudden gust of wind. More and more people heard the gunfire. It was not long before everyone in the encampment seemed to be running somewhere. Warriors, emerging from the south end of the village, saw two lines of mounted Long Knives. They were charging towards the village. Suddenly they slowed, and one line turned west, and the other turned east. They made one long line and then stopped and dismounted. Some of the soldiers grabbed the reins of horses and led them away behind the line. The dismounted soldiers began firing towards the village. Crazy Horse had sprinted back to his own lodge. He had to avoid the men, women, and children who were also running. Black Shawl had his weapons ready. Taking them, Crazy Horse hugged her for a moment, then jumped on his horse and rode towards the firing. Nearly 100 warriors were already among the trees and shrubbery and firing at the line of soldiers. Crazy Horse joined a big, tall man named Gall, a Hunkapapa Lakota war leader. They talked and decided to charge the west end of the soldier line. At that end, there were many of the Shoshone, Crow, and Araka scouts. Crazy Horse and Gall shouted to the mounted warriors close by. Gall led the charge, and Crazy Horse followed, and 40 or so mounted warriors were close behind them. Firing from the soldiers and the warriors was constant. Every moment was filled with the sounds of gunshots. The mounted charge was fast and furious, the pounding hoofbeats of galloping horses mixed with gunfire. Grandpa Niles paused. He and Jimmy were near a marker overlooking the river, which was below them and to the west. Grandpa Niles pointed at a large building in a distance. It resembled a Western movie style fort. "See that?" he said. Jimmy nodded. Major Marcus Reno's soldiers. He was the one in command here, and the Army's Indian scouts were in the east-west line, even with that building and us. It wasn't there in 1876, of course. There were about 120 soldiers and scouts. They were firing north towards the village, the south end of it. Gall and Crazy Horse charged that end of the line. What happened then? Jimmy asked eagerly. The Long Knives and their Indian scouts retreated. Mounted fighters always have an advantage over an enemy. On foot, the warriors chased the soldiers this way, towards us. More and more warriors from the village joined the fight, as many as 200, maybe 300. Major Reno ordered a withdrawal into the trees along the river. The soldiers fled. The Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho fighters stood in among them. The soldiers did not fight back very well. Some were running, others managed to catch horses and ride. They seemed confused, for darn sure they were very scared. Grandpa Niles pointed to the groves of the trees below them, along the west side of the river. About there, he said. The soldiers tried to take cover in the trees like that. But the men were relentless. They fired their guns and bows and started fires. They forced the Long Knives out of the trees. They fled this way, across the river, up the slope. They suffered many casualties crossing the river. Same when they scrambled up the slope. Soldiers were falling, hit by bullets and arrows. Grandpa Niles turned and pointed east, where they stood. They managed to get that far, he went on. There in the meadow they took cover. But they put up barricades with saddles, boxes, and anything they had, even bodies of dead horses. They dug shallow pits in the ground. Crazy Horse listened to the exciting young Cheyenne warrior. The two of them were with other warriors on the west slope ridge. They could see the fallen soldiers on the slopes below them. The blue clothing was easy to see against the green grass. Above them, the sun was high, and the air was hot. The Long Knives are digging holes, piling saddles and boxes, anything they can, the young men reported. Some are on the hills to the south digging holes. I think they know we have surrounded them. Our men are all around. Some of them are trying to get in closer by crawling in the grass. Black Moon, another Lakota war leader, looked at Crazy Horse. Some of our men think we should go overrun them, get them all. What do you think? Crazy Horse asked him. The Long Knives still have lots of bullets, Black Moon said. They keep firing at us. One way is to wait them out. They may be low on water and food. Gall was climbing the slope. Crazy Horse waited until he joined them. I think we should wait, Crazy Horse said. The soldiers cannot go anywhere. We can wait and talk about what to do next. It was easy to see that Gall was angry. He was a big, strong man. An angry scowl on his face made him look very scary. He was about to speak when a high-pitched sound filled the air. All the men near Crazy Horse looked north. They saw a horse and a rider racing towards them. The man on the horse seemed to be making the sound. They watched and waited. The man on the horse stopped to talk to the group of warriors along the river. The warrior pointed up the hill towards Crazy Horse's location. It was plain to see that the man was in a hurry, and he galloped his horse up the hill. He was a young Lakota warrior Crazy Horse recognized. His hands was an eagle bone whistle. He had a high-pitched sound. The young man was agitated. Uncle, he said to Crazy Horse, Long Knives, at the crossing. They tried to ride across the river into the village, and they were stopped. How many? Gall said, looking towards the north. I do not know, the young warrior replied. Many of them, I think. Crazy Horse looked at Gall and Black Moon. We will leave a small number of warriors to keep the barricaded soldiers from leaving. All other warriors should ride fast to meet the new attack. So there was another attack? Jimmy asked. There was, Grandpa Niles said. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not one battle. It was really three. The attack that the young warrior told Crazy Horse about was the second. Custer himself trying to cross the river into the north end of the village. He was stopped, right? Sure was, by a group of old men and boys. They delayed those Long Knives long enough for the warriors sent by Gall and Crazy Horse to get to the crossing. Grandpa Niles pointed to the truck in the parking lot. What do you say we go and pick up the story from there? After a drive for a few miles, they came to a wide, flat gully. It was known as Medicine Tail Coulee. They pulled up over the historical marker with a picture on it. Grandpa Niles pointed towards the river. The soldiers could see the village, he said. They thought it would be easy. Custer thought that Major Reno and his men were coming from the other side. He didn't know that Reno had been chased across the river and up the hill. Custer didn't know that Reno couldn't help him. Those old men and boys stopped the Long Knives before they could cross. Not long after that, the warriors came from the south. Custer had to turn and go that way. Grandpa Niles pointed up the slope, going north. He had no choice. The warriors came from behind him, and then on both sides of his column. North was the only way he could go. So let's go again and trace their path. He put the truck in gear and drove back to the paved road. In a few minutes they were at the top of a hill. After driving through the cattle gate, he stopped at another set of historical markers. They stepped down from the truck. They now were on a ridge that led to the last stand hill, which was about a mile to the north. Somewhere here, Grandpa Niles began, resuming the story, one company of the Long Knives stopped. One company stopped twice, or two companies did the same thing. Anyway, they stopped, dismounted, and faced the oncoming mounted warriors. It was a good attempt, but it didn't work. Our warriors were coming, and they were angry. The gunfire they directed at the soldiers was too much. The soldiers got back on their horses and rode north. From this point on, Custer's soldiers had 5 companies, began to suffer casualties. That is, soldiers were being hit with bullets and falling. Grandpa Niles pointed across the meadows to the north. Remember those white markers? They start right over there. Each one shows where a soldier was found, where he fell. Jimmy was silent for a moment. There are a lot of markers, he said somberly. Yeah, there sure are, Grandpa Niles agreed. Custer had, about 230 men with him. He and only 30 or so made it to the last stand hill. So if you do the subtraction, how many soldiers fell between here and last stand hill? Jimmy said, 200. Yeah, Grandpa Niles agreed. That's about right. And if we do the division to figure out the percentage, divide 30 by 230, the answer is about 15%. So Custer lost about 85% of his men by the time he got to last stand hill. No military commander wants to lose or wants those kind of losses. Grandpa Niles paused and shook his head. He removed his straw from his hat to wipe a bit of sweat off his forehead. Of course, the sad fact is that Custer lost all his men, including himself. Every man in the 5 companies he led was killed in the second part of the battle. That's why there are so many white markers. That's the sad part about war and battles, he concluded. Doesn't matter who you are and what side you're on, it's still sad, no matter what kind of uniform you wear or what color of skin. It's still sad. Jimmy looked across the meadow. He could imagine all those soldiers falling in the grass, falling to the ground. Somewhere inside he wished he would never, ever see the real thing. After a moment he looked up at his grandfather. What did Crazy Horse do in this part of the battle? He asked softly. Well, replied the old man, putting his hat back on, I'll tell you, but first let me tell you what Gall did. Dust rose from the hooves of the galloping Long Knives horses. They were struggling up the long slope. Gall and the warriors were closing the distance. They had raced across the uneven western slopes above the river, arriving at Medicine Trail Coulee, and they saw the soldiers running away. Most of the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors in the encampment had been in battle before. Furthermore, they had been trained to be war fighters since they were children. 8 days before, many had been in the battle where the girl saved her brother, and they knew what to do. Some mounted warriors veered to the right, others to the left. A third group stayed behind the soldiers. If the soldiers stopped, they would be immediately surrounded. If they kept going up the hill and beyond, they would be able to cut down as they rode. At the top of the ridge, a group of Long Knives stopped and dismounted. They formed a line to face the oncoming warriors. The soldiers fired, but it did not slow down the warriors. They returned fire as they galloped. Most of the dismounted Long Knives fired again. Then all of them remounted. They hurried to the north. The onrushing warriors kept riding and firing from horseback. Farther north along the ridge, some Long Knives dismounted again. This time only a few fired at the warriors before remounting. They hurried to catch up with the other soldiers, who were galloping north. The galloping horses were raising a dust cloud that hung just above the ground. Warriors were on either side of the Long Knives and behind as well. The soldiers were being hit and falling from their horses. Gaul whipped his horse to run faster. He was on the slope below the soldiers. He shouted to the warriors near him. "Get ahead of them," he yelled. "Get ahead of them. Dismount and shoot at them from the ground." 8 warriors urged their horses faster. They raced recklessly over the uneven ground and outran the Long Knives' horses on the ridge. The warriors dismounted, formed a line, and knelt to get steady aim. One by one they opened fire with their rifles at the fleeing soldiers. All the while the soldiers were falling and falling. Many of their horses were galloping without riders.